Wow, thank you very much. That's the best introduction I ever had. And she left out all the bad stuff. That's the good part, too. I'm very honored to be here. I have been an admirer of Dr. Knafa for quite a while and have really been inspired by a lot of her research, and especially the way that she approached research about adolescence and her very non-dogmatic style toward what is a topic that tends to arouse a lot of emotion. And so, again, I'm very pleased to be here at this honoring of her career and her work. This talk there will be a printed version of it, I think, that should have a little more detail if any of you are interested in sources or looking at things a little bit longer. I certainly hope some of you will be. It's going to be available, I think, in booklet form, and so you'll be able to see a little more detail if you want. Now, let's see. Figure out how to work this. Good. I did, as Glenn has told you, work with youths and families for about 15 years in communities and wilderness work programs and so forth. And I went back to school in 1992 studying youth issues, and I taught at the University of California for a number of years, sociology, including a class I developed called California Youth in Transition. And I still consider myself completely unqualified to come here and tell you, even in a talk entitled The Panic Over Girls, how girls are today. And I'm not just unqualified because of my age and my gender and my unfortunate last name, but also because I think it's the height of arrogance for someone to come in here and say, well, what I saw in my work or what I think or how I remember my sainted past and my own morals and so forth should dictate how we see a generation, a very diverse generation of 30 million adolescents and young adult women today, aged 10 to 24 in the United States. I mean, look at this particular younger generation today. One of the most racially diverse, one of the most diverse in terms of aspirations and positions in society, and when you get right down to it, they're all individuals. So I don't know how somebody can assemble the arrogance and the narcissism to say, this is the way that an entire generation, this large, this broad, this diverse, really is today. However, and this is where I guess the sociologist in me comes out quite a bit, we can talk about manifest qualities and achievements, the kinds of things we can measure, but I think those of you who have worked with statistics studies and things like that also understand their limitations. So I hope you will keep in mind that there are no perfect measures. All I can say is that measures strike me at least as something we can evaluate, whereas somebody's saying, well, you know, I saw somebody on the bus today and they made me mad and therefore I'm mad at all of that particular group, which tends to be the content of a lot of the more popular books on young people today. I think that, you know, we need to be quite a bit more rigorous and careful and respectful in how we approach these subjects. And I know Dr. Knafa's research was very much concerned with this. How do you know what young people, young women are thinking? How do you let them speak for themselves so that we're not imposing our views constantly and saying, well, we know what's going on? For example, I don't think it's any secret in areas that we can measure today that girls and young women are perpetrating an unprecedented revolution in advancements in education, in employment, and leadership in our society. They are far outstripping by almost every way we can measure both young men and older adults. So we are seeing very, very dramatic achievements in a number of areas. And certainly, just to start out with one caveat here, there are certainly legitimate reasons, for example, to be unhappy over girls' successes in society. Let me give you an example here. Many of you saw this map. It's been around since the November election that shows how the country as a whole voted for President of the United States. And you can see the totals up at the top there. You know, Obama, a considerable victory over McCain and Palin. And these were the states that each party carried, the red states, Republican states, and the blue states, Democratic states. We've seen this map millions of times since November. Okay, now, suppose the electorate, this is the whole electorate, all voters. Now, suppose the electorate consisted only of young women ages 18 to 29, the youngest women voters. This is how the electoral map of the United States would look. It would have been the largest landslide any president has accumulated in our history. Obama would have received close to 100 million votes if only if this country consisted only of young women. You still see a few recalcitrant states there, including my own, Oklahoma. But as a rule, if high school girls, now this is young women ages 18 to 29, if high school girls had been the only voting population, we would have had a virtually all Democratic country. There's indications their views are even more toward the, I guess, the Democratic or liberal end of the scale than young women's are. So if you're a political conservative, it'd be perfectly legitimate for you to say, I don't like this at all. I don't like the way things are going here at all. And so I want to acknowledge, first of all, that there's lots of people who may, for ideological reasons, for various disapproval of trends in modern society, and especially among young women, may have disagreements with what I'm going to say today, and those are open to discussion. I don't mind that. Let me give you some examples of some of the advancements that have accompanied these political trends. We also, by the way, had the largest turnout of young people, including young women, ever in the 2008 election. Many of you are familiar with the advancements of young women in education. This is the percent of young women age 18 to 24 enrolled in higher education of some form. I don't believe this includes vocational technical schools. I think this is universities and colleges. In 1970, fewer than 1/4 of young women were enrolled in higher education. By 2007, it's almost doubled. Well, it's doubled to almost half. Notice the change in men. It's not just a change among young people in general. Men barely increased their enrollment in higher education. So in 1970, young women were very much less likely to be enrolled in college than men. In 2007, very much more likely. And I can't understate the drama of this particular change. In fact, many universities are instituting affirmative action programs for men. Try to get more men and recruit more men for enrollment. Maybe the University of Minnesota is one of them, because at the University of Minnesota, only 53% of undergraduates are women compared to 58% for the rest of the country. So maybe I don't know whether that represents lagging behind the girl revolution or getting in front of the new male affirmative action. Also, we have seen changes in women's earnings in society. In 1950, women earned only 16%, and we have to understand earn is paid occupations. Women do a lot of work that they're not paid for. But paid occupations, 16% in 1950, 39% in 2008. And by every indication, if you look at the education figures up above, and especially in this next slide, women are going to be continuing, in fact, accelerating their share of national income, leadership, employment, and so forth. Today, in colleges around the country and universities, women constitute 58%. Nearly 6 in 10 of all undergraduates. I certainly saw this at UC Santa Cruz, where it was more like 7 in 10. A similar proportion of bachelor's degrees are being awarded to women, and of master's degrees as well. Notice PhDs still 49%, that's almost parity, but that is likely to grow given the undergraduate and master's enrollments of young women. Business, law, and medicine, areas traditionally dominated by men, 50%. Mathematics, who says girls are scared of math? 45% of all math degrees today are awarded to women. Physics degrees, hard sciences. And notice when we get down to the bottom of the graph, full-time faculty, still only 1/3 are women. That's going to change, obviously. Well, I can't say obviously. You can't say anything obviously. But that's going to change, I think. And Congress. That's an improvement over the 11% of Congress that was women when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, but still, I don't want to paint too Pollyanna a picture yet. All right, here's one of the most important graphs that I'm going to show you today, and it's one that I think gets to the heart of of the anxieties about young women, which we'll also get to in a moment. If you go back to 1950, the 50s are somehow held up. I grew up in the 50s. I don't agree with this, but they were somehow held up as the time of great safety and tranquility, and everything was perfect back then, and so many politicians want to return us to that life of the 1950s. And one reason you can see is that, I recognize as a controversial argument, is the parents look like the children. Very white-dominated society. Only 17% of girls aged 10 to 19 and 8%, or look at it the other way around, 83% of girls were white, non-Latino, non-Hispanic, 92% of adults back in 1950. Not a lot of change through 1970, only small increases in the minority proportion of the population, but look what happened from 1970 to 2010 over the last 40 years. We've seen more than a doubling in the proportion of the population, the young population that is non-white, and a similar increase among elders, although 74, three-fourths of all Americans who are in older age groups are still non-Hispanic white, compared to 42% of young women. This is a dramatic change. No society that I can find has undergone such a dramatic and fast racial transition. And this is something that I think I'm going to argue to you today is underlying a lot of the anxiety about girls today, but cannot be admitted. So we have a situation today, and even in Minneapolis, more than half of the population under age 25 is now black, Latino, Asian, Native American, and other non-white and mixed race. Now, we still see some considerable discrepancies, and that's been the object of some political discussion in the United States recently, that women's wages still lag far behind men. And we're going to see if the greater achievements, the much greater achievements of young women today compared to men are going to lead to some corrections in historically low wages paid to women. But in any case, I think this graph is very important, because one of the things that it shows is that this visceral fear that as the United States, and I certainly see it in California, this visceral fear that the United States becoming more racially diverse is somehow going to lead to some kind of social devolution. And I realize that this is a rather directly racist view, but it's often expressed in much subtler terms. Well, you know, populations that don't go to school as much and don't go to higher education as much are growing faster in the United States, and therefore we should be seeing a diminishing in younger generations' achievement. And we even see some rather mean-spirited books like The Dumbest Generation out there that purport to document this. If you read these books, they're really not very impressive. But this kind of visceral fear that racial diversity somehow accompanies a destabilization of society, as far as I can tell, is absolutely untrue. We have seen the most diverse generation of young women in history that I can find also being among the highest, or being the highest achieving generation in history as well. So there's nothing to fear from diversity that I can find. Now, change on this scale, I mean, let's face it. Sum up a little bit here. More independent girls in society, more visible in society, getting more education and jobs, making more money amid greater racial diversity, and having available to them all kinds of communications and information technologies that allow them to really communicate on a global basis. That's got to be scaring some people, you know, when you get right down to it. That's got to be scaring traditionalists, and maybe many of you younger people today who grew up with this wouldn't, or maybe you perceive this, or maybe it's hard for you to perceive how people could see this, anything bad about this. But just the very fact of this speed of change in society is going to scare people who are more traditional, and the thing that's interested me is it's not just conservatives. It's not just traditional-minded people who would like society to go back the way it was 100 years ago. That have these fears. We're also seeing it among many more liberal writers and authors, and we'll get to that in a moment. So, we are seeing, accompanying girls' rampaging successes, girls and young women's rampaging successes in society, a massive rising fear that there must be, not just that there is, but there must be a dark side. What exactly is this dark side to the successes, the manifest successes, the advancements in larger society that no one denies? What is the dark side? And they're advanced by authors that I'll show a few of their book covers, but there's really a very, very large number of commentators who argue that this has some kind of terrible, bad aspect to it. Now, actually, there are two dark sides. First, girls are presumed to be innately vulnerable, and their emergence from the supposedly protected world of homes and communities, how well they were protected in homes and communities is, of course, very dubious, into this dangerous, larger, male-dominated world is exposing physically delicate girls to predators and mentally fragile girls to worldly corruptions. Now, this is pretty much the same fear that was expressed 100 years ago to deny women the right to vote. If you let women out of the house and let them into larger, corrupt male society, everybody knows how bad men are, and women will become more like men, and society will fall apart because the innate virtues of women will be corrupted by larger society. This is really a very old argument, that you need to keep women confined because otherwise society will corrupt them the way it has men. This is an argument that's been very popular among a lot of authors. In fact, almost every author I read advances this kind of argument. It's certainly behind the claims that internet predators and so forth are threatening young women. A recent article in Atlantic magazine, for example, one of the nation's more liberal magazines, argued that we are going to see a day where girls in particular will not be allowed to go online unless they're supervised by adults. That is, that this world out there is that dangerous. This was not advanced by conservatives. This was being advanced by across the spectrum. Psychologist Mary Pfeiffer, who wrote Reviving Ophelia books, makes exactly this argument, that fragile girls are being exposed to worldly corruptions and outside the safety of their homes. This is causing a great deal of trouble for girls. All kinds of psychological disorders are manifest. Now, when you look at, for instance, I looked at these dangers that are supposedly present in the internet world, the predators that we see all the time on television. Almost seems like every week somebody has some kind of splash on this danger that internet predators pose. The University of New Hampshire did a major study of thousands of law enforcement agencies nationwide and asked a question I wish people would ask more often. How many cases of this have you seen? How many girls have been murdered, kidnapped, raped, assaulted, or menaced in any way by people they met online, physically menaced, in a sense that would break the law? They came up with all these thousands of law enforcement agencies an estimate of 25 cases nationwide. Now, these 25, of course, get a lot of headlines, and so it seems to be very widespread danger. But they were unable to actually document that there were these terrible dangers that were occurring. Now, you can contrast this with the 100 cases that are substantiated every day across the United States, every day, of physical and sexual abuse of girls that occur in their homes, overwhelmingly inflicted by parents and caretakers. This is, the idea of the home being a protected place is also not completely true. So that's the first kind of dark side, this idea that girls are being corrupted and menaced by the larger world. The second dark side, I think, has become even more compelling, and that is the fear of girls themselves becoming more dangerous, more violent, meaner, more promiscuous, more bullying, more cruelly fashion-driven, and shallow and so forth, materialistic. This is also a very traditional fear. In fact, we see it repeated throughout the ages, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. So I think this second dark side has become even more a subject of news commentary, popular commentary, and so forth. In one sense, it's not so much the big bad wolf that we fear anymore, it's Little Red Riding Hood. Here are some examples of this kind of fear. A couple of books came out recently. Many books are on this subject. These are two of the most popular, Sugar and Spice and then See Jane Hit. These are by noted scholars. The authors of Sugar and Spice are the Harvard School of Public Health. See Jane Hit is by a noted violence expert. He actually heads an institute, University Violence Institute. I believe from reading their books, would be on the liberal side of the political spectrum. Again, these are not conservatives complaining about women getting too uppity. These are more liberal authors. And I fully respect the idea of a political debate about which way society should go, morally, culturally, and so forth. But I don't appreciate just making things up. And these two books make things up. I mean, I spent a lot of time, and many others as well, investigating the claims made in this book, looking at their sources, looking at their statistics, looking at how they made a general argument. You know, again, we can see somebody, I don't know, walking down the street and think of all kinds of reasons to hate them and write a book about how awful they are, or the way they're dressed, or the way they talk, or whatever, based on a personal anecdote. And that's what so much of these books indicate is, well, they're just disturbed, they're just troubled by the way girls talk or act. And when you look at their general arguments, there's almost no basis for them. In fact, what's disturbing me is that if you took these kinds of statements about girls today and you made them about any other group in society, any racial group or ethnic group or immigrant group or so forth, they would be considered hate speech. this disturbs me very much that we still, in the 2000s, have sanctioned hate speech, that it's still all right to go ahead and say very negative things. You can, of course, say, well, we're concerned about them and so forth, but it still boils down to the same thing. You're creating a demeaning public image of an entire group in society based on what I consider to be very flimsy evidence. And I think that if these books are investigated, that will be readily apparent. Another thing that disturbs me is the kinds of claims that are being made today, that girls are more violent, they're having sex more wantonly and having babies more wantonly and so forth. They're more aggressive. All these are stereotypes traditionally associated with minority women. These are racist stereotypes in addition. So I think we should demand a very high level of evidence that an entire generation has gone wrong as badly as many of these authors insist they have, before we take these kinds of statements lightly, because the end result of this, as we're going to see, is not going to be very pretty. Some of the solutions and arguments that these authors are making are I think, very damaging over the long run. These are some press on the right. There is the typical press presentation. Reporter was absolutely uncritical. I don't understand why we even have a press in this country if they're not going to be somewhat skeptical toward popular claims, but this was an absolutely unskeptical report, and very self-congratulatory toward not only the parents and teachers and older girls, but also toward the media for supposedly taming this savage younger generation. And we see a couple of books on the left there about how girls are supposedly more promiscuous and corrupted by the media. Again, part of this larger argument that the female mentality is very fragile, and if it's exposed to corrupting influences, they will emulate the worst of the things that they see. I don't understand, you see the book up in the upper left-hand corner, The Lolita Effect. What's so terrifying about this particular picture on the cover? It's a girl putting on lipstick. And the reason this was chosen for the cover indicates to me, and also the book itself, when you read the book itself, a very puritanical, absolutely puritanical attitude, that under no circumstances should young women be thinking about sex, let alone engaging in any kind of sexual activity of any kind, except within the confines of an adult-approved, say, sex education class or something like that, which preferably will tell them not to do it. So I'm puzzled by the level of puritanism that we're seeing in these books. And in these commentaries, if any kind of untoward thought, therefore, constitutes some kind of unheard of corruption. Now, the books are really on a large variety of subjects. Here's another couple of them on the idea that girls today are more promiscuous and sexually dissolute and so forth, and also becoming meaner. Again, I want to make it very clear here, I'm not objecting to complaints about, say, or books on specific kinds of problems. I think it's very good that authors, psychologists, social workers, and so forth would do books saying, we see these kind of particular problems. That's one thing, to say, well, there's a problem with eating disorder, or there's a problem with substance abuse, or there's a problem with whatever it is that you think, mental health. And this could be said about any group in society. But to say a whole generation, or to generalize to all girls the way these books do, and the reason I'm picking on these authors is they generalize to whole generations, and they claim most or all girls suffer all these terrible, unheard of problems that, of course, we don't suffer and didn't when we were growing up. And this is just simply, from what I can find, even from investigating these books on sources, completely wrong. There's no grounds for saying the things that they're saying. In fact, in many ways, it's just the opposite. So, by the way, this Unhooked book, you've all heard the term hooking up, right? What do you think it is? Hooking up. In these books, it means anything from sending a couple of flirty emails, that's hooking up. You don't have to actually meet the person, to orgies. I mean, it's a very, very broad term. So when they say lots of young women or men are hooking up today, well, yeah, I think most people send emails. So a lot of this is when you look at the term, what the terms actually mean, even though they'll give some scary anecdotes, and I don't know to the extent which these anecdotes are embellished or don't exist, then it looks quite a bit more frightening, and unfortunately the news media has not questioned what these terms actually mean. What does dating violence actually mean? Dating violence, you know, the studies that are showing alarming levels of teenage dating violence. You know how they define dating violence? Sitting next, well, first of all, how do they define dating? You're dating if you're in middle school, if you sit next to somebody in school. Honestly, they say, sit next to this person in school. The mildest kind of interactions are considered dating. What's violence? Violence is having any partner say anything that bothers you. I'm not kidding. These are the definitions. And so they'll come up with these very high levels. I certainly don't dispute concern about real violence in intimate partner relationships, and those occur among every group in society. But when you define them in this ridiculous way, as if, you know, one of them was, has your partner ever told you how to dress? That's violence. That's considered emotional violence. Somebody says, oh, I like that dress on you. It sounds violent to me. So I don't have any problems with authors raising, or any commentators in society raising real problems, but I do have a problem when they start saying that we really need to do something about this entire generation because it's completely out of control. Now, another thing that you'll notice when you research things historically is, and many of these authors don't seem to, is these same kinds of concerns recur throughout recorded history. I think if we could translate some of the hieroglyphs on walls from tens of thousands of years ago, there'd be complaints about how girls don't gather right or whatever the problem was. And they're always the same complaints. Look at this quote from Peter the Hermit. It's the same kind of thing that we see today. 1925, girl of 14 is the problem of today. That was the headline in the Sunday paper. I think it would look very much like headlines today. During the 40s and 50s, as we'll see, there was a panic in the United States over girls' delinquency that was just as charged as the panic today. And the FBI and all kinds of government documentaries came out and arguing that girls have never been more violent, more promiscuous, more wanton, and so forth. Here's some of the popular representations from the peaceful 50s of girls. And there were hundreds of these films. I can't believe how many of these films and books came out during this period. Here's some posters of them. Notice that the girl in the violent ones there has a cigarette. That tells us everything we need to know. Notice the one down in the lower right-hand corner has a knife, but let's see, there's one with a gun. There's several girls with guns on this page. And we know what that one standing in the streetlight's up to. Date bait. I don't know what that movie's about. Real panics. There's a great book called Teenage Confidential put out by Barson and Heller of all the posters of these movies and all the claims that were made back then. The 50s may appear tranquil to us today, but they were a time of considerable panic over the behaviors of girls. And really, these go back centuries. These kinds of claims that today's girls, whenever today was, are always the most promiscuous, the most brazen, the most unladylike, the worst generation that we've ever seen. These go back centuries, and they're almost always the same kind of complaints. There's nothing new, nothing original. Now, if we're going to talk about whether, I've been making some claims here that these statements I don't think are true. I don't think they're true about the whole generation. I don't know about any individuals, but I don't think they're true about the whole generation. How would we possibly know? I mean, it's just as bad to say they're not true as to say they're true if you don't have any evidence for what you're saying. So what do the best sources say about recent trends in girls' behavior, whether it's violence or mental health or those sorts of things? What do we find from the best measures we have? Recognizing that the best measures are also always flawed. But they again, at least try to look at an entire generation rather than somebody's personal impression about what's going on. All right, first of all, have we seen modern girlhood degenerate into a very unhappy time, as authors like Mary Pfeiffer and others argue, or Jean Twenge in Generation Me, or James Garbarino, or Prothero Stith, or some of these other authors argue that girls today are far unhappier and more miserable than they were back when we were growing up, whenever that was. What do the best trends show? Well, there's a few surveys that go back that far, 20, 30, 40 years, that ask girls themselves what they think. And I think this is the first thing you do if you're going to try to find out what a group of people think, an entire group is. You assemble a representative sample, and you ask them what they think. You don't just find one or two that agree with you and put them in a book, or a couple of examples that agree with you. And this is really a lot of the research that Dr. Knafa I think really pioneered was the combination of the survey, where you ask a representative sample of girls nationwide questions about what they think and what they're doing, and then you assemble a focus group where they can explain their answers, because you check yes, no, or A, B, C, D, or 1 through 5 on a Likert scale on a survey. That could mean 100 different things. I mean, let's face it, if somebody says they're depressed, they could be depressed about themselves and their own lives, or they could be depressed about the state of the world. Very different kinds of things, and maybe there's a lot of things going on in the world that there's something wrong with you if you're not depressed about them. All right, what do we find from girls' own comments? The first survey, big survey, was in 1976. This is Monitoring the Future. It's by the University of Michigan Institute of Social Research. They survey thousands of high school seniors every year. And they ask them some very basic questions that have been the same over time. Do you feel safe? 66% of girls in 76 said they feel safe, 71% in 2005. Not this rampaging fear. Are you satisfied with yourself? Pretty much the same figures over the last 30 to 40 years, slight increase. Are you happy with your friends? This idea that girls live in a world where peers torture them, the mean girl world, and so forth. Certainly there's some that do, but as a rule, most girls find their friends to be among their most positive things in their life. Now, are we seeing an increase in unhappiness, as I mentioned? No. Are we seeing an increase in drug use? There's a lot of claims today that girls in particular are taking more drugs, particularly antidepressants. And in fact, those who do admit that there has been a decrease in suicide in recent decades attribute it to more medication. I don't find this to be true at all. The 70s and 60s were quite a medicated time, as a matter of fact. And if you look at the number of girls who say they were taking antidepressants, both prescribed and on their own prescription, it's dropped dramatically. Same thing with stimulants. Stimulants and depressant use has dropped very sharply among girls. Now, you can ask questions about people and how they feel about themselves, and you can put them into a survey and say generations may have, this generation may be somewhat more optimistic and less depressed and so forth than generations of the past. But then you have to look at a second kind of measure, which I think is very important, and that's outcome measures. If girls today are more optimistic, we would not expect to see suicides going up. If they feel safer, we would not expect to see homicide going up. So if there's a contradiction between these measures, there's a reason to doubt what you're seeing. Actually, we see, and by the way, 1976 and 2005 had very similar populations of girls, so this is not due to population changes. We see dramatic decreases in the number of girls who die by violent means. We see very large decreases in suicidal type deaths, which include suicides, drug overdoses, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and those kinds of things. Very dramatic declines in suicidal type deaths. And also something I think people would not expect at all, very sharp decline in the number of girls who are murdered. And a lot of this will actually come to another irony in a few minutes, which is the apparent increase in girls' violent crime. Well, I'll get to it in a few minutes, and you'll be able to see the irony. Also, the number of pregnancies measured by the Centers for Disease Control, the National Center for Health Statistics, has declined dramatically among girls aged 10 to 19 over the period. So we're not seeing manifest outcomes that would contradict the optimistic views that girls give of themselves. We're also not seeing in the last 10 years, when all this corrupting media, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, Powerpuff Girls, all the violence on television by girls, Blossom and Bubbles and Buttercup, what are the names of the Powerpuff Girls? There are authors that seriously claim that the Powerpuff Girls are driving girls to more violence. These came about mostly in the last 10 to 12 years, as well as large internet patronage or matronage. Murder has declined. Murder, these are arrests. This is violence by girls here. This is tabulated by the FBI. Notice the declines in virtually every kind of serious crime by girls, so that the rate of violence has declined very sharply. And this occurred even as the population of girls increased by over 1 million over the last decade. Very sharp declines in violent crime. So why are we seeing these claims that girls are more violent today? Assaults in particular. Many of the authors who claim girls are more violent talk about an increase in assault rates. Here's the assaults per 100,000 population over the last 10 years. You can see from 1995 to 2007, the rate of assaults among girls declined rather dramatically. And this was, again, supposed to be during this very corrupting period of worse media influences and everything else. Now, girls are also asked in surveys, are you being victimized more? because obviously the FBI and the police don't find out about all crime. So there's a thing called the National Crime Victimization Survey that asks girls and women and men, are you victims of crime in the past year? And they have a very large sample, like 100,000 in their samples. So it's a very large sample, and they assemble estimates of the amount of criminal victimization that occurred. And this captures crimes that are not reported to police. If you look at, these are the number of violent victimizations reported by girls ages 12 to 19. And this survey has been consistent since 1993. So I took the first year, 1993, and compared it to the most recent year, 2006. And we see girls not only show declines in assault arrests, but they show declines in victimization by assault, very large ones over the last 12 years. And again, remember, the female population increased rather sharply during this period. So the rate declines would even be larger. Sexual violence, such as rape and sexual assault, has declined by nearly 50%, certainly that large by rate, over the last 13 years. Robbery, down dramatically. So girls reporting that they have been violently victimized has really fallen very sharply in the last 13 years. And you may ask why this is not the impression we get from news media reports or from commentaries or even scholarly authors writing reports. Why don't they say this? Well, as a matter of fact, this has been investigated by the Bureau of Justice Statistics over the last actually 20 to 30 years with the best information we have, and they claim, and I agree with them from looking at their measures, that girls' violence has not increased at all, that this is a myth. In fact, one that has some very bad implications for how girls are treated. Here's another example of questions that are asked to girls by Monitoring the Future. And again, these are self-reporting surveys. They go very well with police statistics and public health statistics, that fewer girls are in fights, fewer girls carry weapons today, fewer girls fear for their safety at school, and many fewer girls are violently victimized, especially in serious forms. And these are direct contradictions to the kind of claims that we see in the media. Now, here's the one area, and I want to, before I conclude here, talk about the one area where we have seen an increase in violence purportedly involving girls. And that is in simple assault, which is everything from, a slapping fight. Anyway, it's assault that does not cause serious injury and does not involve a weapon, so simple assault. Now, here's the irony of this. Certainly there has been. If you look at the top line of this chart, you see that for girls under age 18, in 1981, the first year that figures were assembled for girls by age, we see about 21,000 simple assault arrests, and it increased to almost 95,000 in 2007. So unquestionably, an increase in girls' arrests for that. Does that demonstrate that the girls are getting more violent? All these authors insist, yes, oh yes, this proves it, especially the Harvard School of Public Health. Arrests do demonstrate real violence trends in society, they say. Well, if that's true, then every group in society has become dramatically more violent. Now look at the increase for age 35 to 54 over that same period in misdemeanor assault arrests. 18,200 in 1981, rocketing up to 115,000. So the mom is now getting arrested more than girls for assault. All right? Even senior citizens have seen an increase. Now, what could cause that? If every other kind of violence is going down, police reports, victimization reports, all these things show violence of every kind going down. What do we get this one area that's going up? And it went up among everyone, although girls are the only ones being singled out in most popular commentary. Well, you can think for yourselves about what might be causing this trend. What happened in the 1980s? Police, legislatures, judges started taking domestic violence much more seriously. So offenses that before the 1980s would have resulted in a police warning, they go to a house where there's a disturbance, they issue a warning to the parties, and then they leave. No, not anymore. If there's any evidence of violence, and I'm sure this is true in Minnesota as it is in most states, police have to make an arrest. If there's evidence of violence or injury, they have to take somebody downtown. And this results in an increase in arrests. Now, it also has increased very sharply for men. I don't show the male figures on here, but they also increased very sharply. And women's violence, although it's much rarer than men's, tends to occur in the house. If it occurs at all, it tends to occur at home. So you would get, in a domestic violence enforcement situation, arrests of many more women as well. And that's what those who have studied these trends especially at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, argue, is these are not real increases in violence. These are increases in police attention to a kind of violence that had not gotten much attention in the past. So it's very ironic that one of the things that may be making girls and women safer today, and that is the fact that law enforcement is taking domestic violence much more seriously than in the past, and making arrests and attempting to get troubled families both into the legal system and into the various helping systems to resolve domestic violence issues before they become serious. It may be the very thing that's leading to this claim that girls are getting more violent. To me, it's an entirely specious kind of theory, and I don't understand how scholars can be making this argument. Again, I'm baffled by the extreme kinds of statements that we're seeing made. And I also think, and this is something I resent very much, that this idea that the media causes violence, taken to the extremes that these authors take it to, and especially when they say that things that happened over the last 10 years have caused girls to get more violent, dramatically more violent, and you know, we see these, Hermione, for instance, in Harry Potter, it has been blamed by James Garbarino and also on national news reports repeatedly for being the cause of girls getting more violent. Girls are not getting more violent, and that to me trivializes the problem. But anyway, this is the argument that these authors almost universally make, is that girls are getting more violent because figures in Hollywood, female figures in Hollywood have gotten more violent, therefore girls must be getting more violent. Again, I can't fathom these kinds of arguments, especially the large decrease in girls' violence. Now, I don't want to leave you with a trivialization, though, of violence in general. Violence is an extremely serious problem in the United States. It's more serious here than in almost any other Western nation, and I wanted to put the graph up here. This is for women of all ages. This is their murder rate, the rate at which they're murdered compared to other Western countries. The United Kingdom has a very low rate, as you can see, Japan and Germany and France and so forth. The U.S. is, unfortunately, many times higher than other societies. So one of the things that I don't like about this sensationalization and trivialization of girls' violence is that it gets in the way of looking at real causes, real important causes that are much more difficult to face than simply berating a movie or a book or a cartoon for causing more violence. Now, many of you probably work with girls. The years that I spent working with young people, there were two serious problems in girls' lives and in young people's lives in general that were correlated both in studies and in what I saw. I'm going to say for the first time what I saw because it seems to agree with larger studies of the subject. Physical and sexual abuse are seriously linked to greater problems among girls. More than 100,000 girls were substantiated victims of physical and sexual violence in their homes in 2006. I think we could say, again, without attempting to stigmatize any population, that those are connected with more troubles in later life. And then second, and by the way, the authors that talk about violence about girls, they will mention abuse as being one factor, but it's usually in a list or on a page or in a paragraph. It's not what they really want to talk about. They don't want to talk about abuse. They don't want to talk about poverty. Impoverished areas of cities and communities tend to have much higher rates of some kinds of violence than others. Yet these kinds of problems are not really mentioned. They're not, let's face it, they're not fun to talk about. They're not nearly as fun as putting some kind of popular culture image on television and saying that must be the cause of why girls are more violent today. So I think that we have to, especially in scholarly endeavors, adopt a much more rigorous attitude toward what is it we can actually show is going on and what would be the causes of the problems that we do see, not this kind of silly trivialization that I think is dominating discussion. Okay, finally, to sum up here, I think that if these fears are not faced, we are going to see them worsen in the future, the fears I mean. First of all, girls' racial diversity is going to increase. It's already, populations in Latin American countries are very diverse. The United States is headed in that direction, and Western Europe and Japan, well, I don't know about Japan. Western Europe is headed in that direction as well. It's a much greater diversity, racial diversity. This is going to increase so that by 2030, a majority of the entire youth population of the United States is going to have no racial majority, racial or ethnic majority. This will be the first major society that has undergone this kind of transition. in which you have a purportedly egalitarian society that is very diverse. We have a history of monocultures, basically, that are now becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. Secondly, girls' access to global information and communications will expand. There's no practical way to prevent it and no reason to try to prevent it, this kind of thing from occurring. Technology is very likely to make the world more interconnected. And those who fear that, well, they're going to see more of it. Women's advances in education, employment, and leadership will continue. That's premised on the idea that what we have said are society's pathways to success, such as school, more education, and so forth, actually do bring you more success in society. If that happens, then girls are doing all the things right to become much more influential in society, in business, in political leadership, in every other kind of life that we have. That should be happening. So finally, what then is the basis of this fear? I've hinted at a couple of things that I think overall represent something that could be very damaging to girls in society, and that is what Margaret Mead termed 30 years ago. She didn't use this term. I'm the one that kind of am opposing this term, but I would call it evolutionary fear. Now, Margaret Mead wrote a very remarkable book back in 1970. It's a very short book called Culture and Commitment. And she argued that from all her work in anthropology, she had seen that even in her lifetime, societies had evolved from the old homogeneous, static, isolated tribal cultures that dominated human existence for many hundreds of thousands of years, in which elders really were the power in society because they knew what that society needed. The society didn't change much, so the oldest people in society knew what the younger people needed to learn. Parents knew what their kids needed to learn, and the adults had this confidence that their kids were going to grow up very much like the grown-ups. There was a continuity in older societies, and I think when you see a lot of nostalgia for the past, a lot of this is this kind of supposed continuity, that our kids are very familiar, that they will be just like us, that they will grow up it really in something we find familiar and can recognize. That's not true anymore, Mead said. Societies are now changing very rapidly. Social change, the diversification caused by immigration, global immigration, is changing societies rapidly into cultures that the elders do no longer recognize. This is not the old society that they grew up in. And so when they say that young people today are different or we don't feel that they're familiar, that's correct in a lot of ways. Young people grow up in a very different world than older members of society did. And so this creates a lot of fear and disconnection. And Mead worried, again, and presented very good evidence that older generations are in danger of abandoning younger generations are in danger of being abandoned by older generations because of a level of irrational fear that is really a fear of change. And change itself has to be evaluated for what it is, not just because it is something different. So evolutionary fear is a kind of visceral fear that things just aren't right. They're just not like things are just not like they were when we were growing up. The way we were growing up is the way things ought to be, and therefore any change has got to be menacing. And so I can find no logical reason for the panic toward girls today. We ought to be much more optimistic, and we ought to be people who celebrate racial diversity ought to be very happy with these trends, that they're not bringing all the horror stories that some might have been concerned about. But the ultimate result, if we don't get a grip on this fear, is we are seeing advocacy now for returns to structures of the past, where girls are really, and young women are seen as they should be more in the home, and they should be subject to more supervision, which anthropologists call traditional female supervision, where girls were prevented from, and women were prevented from having rights because they needed to be protected, mostly from themselves, but also from larger threats. Those are the kinds of arguments we're seeing being made today for what ought to be done about this supposed girl crisis that we have. Now, everything I've seen in Dr. Knafa's writing that I've studied is that she was delighted with young women's advances and achievements in society. I did not see anything in her writing that indicates a dark side. She didn't gloss over problems that occurred or girls that have certain problems, but she didn't attribute this to a whole generation or some kind of horrible evolution that is occurring in modern society. And I certainly hope that her research models and some more rigorous examinations and discipline will lead us away from this current panic. I hope this current panic is temporary, and I hope it gives way to a more reasoned and optimistic view of society's changes consistent with the adaptation that we see, the very spectacularly successful adaptation that we see among a generation of young women themselves. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.